Jerome Preisler, welcome to Suit Up the Podcast.
It is my pleasure to be here.
Now, I asked you about this before I hit the record button, but for people, especially on YouTube, I think that they're going to ask too. You were telling me about the figures you have behind you. Where'd you get them?
Yeah,
What's your interest?
well, when I was a kid, my parents really couldn't afford to get me the authentic GI Joes. So typically, like my mother would go to John's Bargain Store on
Uh-huh.
13th Avenue in Brooklyn, and come home with these knockoffs that, once you started fighting with them, getting involved in battle, their arms would fall off. They would be like
They
seriously injured.
legalistic.
Yes. So once I had some disposable income, that happily coincided with late boomers being recognized as a market for these nostalgic GI Joes, because apparently there were a lot of moms shopping at John's Bargain Store. So I purchased these and a great many others, and these were really good though. These are commemorative GI Joes, World War II era GI Joes. You can't see it, but I even have a Ted Williams. I have
Oh,
an Eisenhower on the other side of the room. There's a Tuskegee Airman there. There's also one of my favorites, which is, I don't know if he's it's a GI Joe that represents the only the Nisei division, which was the most decorated combat division in World War II, and was composed exclusively of Japanese Americans, many of
that's really
whom,
cool.
yes, and especially that they
Mhm.
were involved in some really uh, uh, horrific, bloody combat. There are innumerable acts of heroism attributed to them in battle, and what really overlays this all and really speaks to their heroism is that many of them had families that were in internment camps at the time.
Mhm.
So these were young men who were intent on showing their loyalty, demonstrating their loyalty to the country, and fighting for it. So they were anyway. That's my GI Joes. There's a
Well,
story to my dolls.
and that's cool. I mean, that's really what makes having objects like that worthwhile. So,
Yeah.
like behind my head, I'm gonna swivel. I've got the Lego typewriter behind me, which it's one
Ah.
of Lego figured out at this point, like the market, much like boomers for commemorative GI Joes. You have a market in me that did Legos as a kid that now they make bigger Lego sets that are display pieces, and
And you're
so
blocking. Are you? Is that an electric? Is that supposed to be an electric
it's
or a
supposed to be a
manual?
manual. In fact, you can hit the keys and it punches like a thing. It's not
That's
obviously a
fantastic.
functional, but it moves. It's cool to get and collect stuff like that, especially if it
Yeah.
has sentimental value or it means something. And to your point earlier about the Japanese unit, I think the thing that most people don't appreciate about World War II is that because we've movied it so much, we have the Sansa Iwo Jima films and that ilk. We've made it very black and white, and in a lot of ways it was, but we don't appreciate the fact that it was still a war with a lot of nuance, and we weren't the good guys doing everything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Even another one of those dolls is a Tuskegee Airman, and of course
Mm-hmm.
they were prohibited from fighting in Europe because they were black.
Mm-hmm.
And we could go on about it, but in fact, I had wanted to do a book about a unit called the Triple Nickels. They were paratroopers. They were the 555th, and they had trained with the 82nd Airborne, and was an all black. It was an all black unit, and
Mm-hmm.
they too were not allowed to fight. And this was something that really hurt um, never hurt their morale, because
Mm-hmm.
they were just the best of the best, but certainly wounded their pride, and
Mm-hmm.
it had to be extremely painful for them. Yeah, I mean, as you say, there's a whole social milieu that existed, and we really see it in the context of these 2-hour films. So it's a really good point.
So when you're selecting a story that you want to explore in narrative nonfiction, I'm just curious because there's such a broad scope. Like this story sounds amazing. How do you whittle down to what you want to write about? Because there is so much, especially in the scope of history.
It's really what grabs me and what I discover no one else has written about, and that usually surprises me. When I wrote a book called First to Jump, which was about the 101st, a particular unit of the 101st and 82nd Airborne, and these were the Pathfinders who were the first men to jump onto Normandy hours before the invasion. They were alone. There were about 300 of them. They had no
Mm-hmm.
air cover, and they certainly had no one on the ground to help them out. At any rate, I had remembered reading about a page or two uh, uh, of their story, and I think it was one of the great Stephen Ambrose World War II histories. And I was absolutely positive that there had to be 10 books about them. So I just started Googling and I started searching Amazon, and I realized, in fact, there were not. There were books in which there might have been a chapter or there might have been a few pages, but no one had really extensively covered them. So when I hit on that, it's just, as a writer, you've struck gold. And that happens serendipitously maybe, but that happens to me pretty often. And that's usually a big part of my choice, which is, wow, this is really a cool subject. Somebody's written this book. Well, no, wow, and that's it. And
Well,
then of
because
course, I mean, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
No, it's just, and obviously eh, woven into all that is that I see a compelling story or a really compelling character or set of characters that I think I just love to write about, or they're usually the same sort of characters I'd like to write about in my novels, except they're real.
Yeah,
So,
I had seen there's a I'm a big James Bond fan, as perhaps the poster behind
mm,
might have suggested. And I had looked up at one point, there was this guy called Dusko Popov, was like this. He was like codename Tricycle. He's supposed to be one of those guys that helped influence James Bond. This guy was like doing research for a spy novel and was like, oh, look at up this guy, and then found out no one had written about him. And I'm like, and that's why he then wrote a book about it.
mhm.
Think it was called Into the Lion's Mouth, something like that. Anyway, the second comment I was going to make is you wrote a book called Civil War Commandos.
Civil War Commando.
Civil War Commando, and that's another example of just an interesting historical figure that no one's really talked about before.
Yeah, and the way that came about was I had just before that I'd finished First to Jump and was looking for another narrative nonfiction, and um, I thought about writing, jumping to a different era, and
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to pitch to the same editor, so it
Mm-hmm.
was going to be a uh, military related subject. So I found a really great one that took place during the American Revolution, which again nobody had written about. I'm not going to say what it is because still no one's written about it. So of course my editor loves it. He goes to all these meetings, and as unfortunately happens too often in these meetings, is told, well, we really don't want to, we don't go back as far as the American Revolution, which is a whole subject. We can do another show on that. But so then I think, well, okay, I'll skip to the next war, or the next big one anyway.
Yeah.
So I looked for something in the Civil War, and that the American Revolution story was a naval story, and I really was
Mm-hmm.
keen on writing about the Navy. So uh, none of us really, most of us don't think of the Civil War as having a lot of naval action, and yet
No.
it turns out that there was a great deal of it, and so I start Googling and I come up with this individual commander, Will Cushing, who
Mm-hmm.
was, you can call him a maverick, you can call him a nut, you can call him whatever you want, but ultimately he was a hero and an extremely daring and effective hero. And it was again the same thing. This was one where not only was I stunned that there were a couple of books that had been written much earlier, like in the 50s, and they're
Mm,
they didn't they really, there was one in particular that really wasn't sourced. There was dialogue in it that
mm,
I could never source, and just the way I write, I it that was a little off-putting for me.
yeah.
The book itself, I'm not putting it down because it was a great,
Mhm.
actually was a great resource for me in many ways. However, there was nothing done in the way I would have written it. And but in addition to that, as I started to say, uh, this was the cliche of the story that's almost too wild to be real, that you would say, well, this has, this is like a movie, which of course is a ridiculous thing to say in its own way, but it was in fact like a movie. And why no one's ever made a movie about it, I don't know. But yeah, that was another. It was just another one of
Mhm.
those things that it's almost magical in a certain way as to how these things present themselves to you. Because you think it might happen once and you think it might happen twice, but when it starts happening 3 or 4 times, you wonder if that's your mutant X-Men power.
Well, it reminds me of Homer in that idea that these are stories that we have. These are history
Yeah,
that we
yeah,
get the opportunity to retell.
yeah,
And that's why, like, there's that new Guy Ritchie movie coming out on Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Like, no one talked about the SOE for years,
yeah,
despite it being a part of World War II. All of a sudden, click, it hits the zeitgeist, and everyone's now wanting to do something with it. It's just
yeah,
fascinating to see how we mine history for things, and some things go, some things don't, but there's always something interesting there. Like
yeah,
Theodore Roosevelt's one of my favorite heroes, like just in general.
yeah,
Amazing guy. Scream Teddy Roosevelt in High American. And he liked writing histories about these random people from the American Revolution because at his era, that was that cycle period where they started going back to that. And there was this guy named Gouverneur Morris who
mm,
was like the just that name alone, you're like, how has this guy? He had a peg leg, even. He was practically a pirate. Like, how did this not become more of a thing? But
yeah,
that's why it's so cool to find those characters when you're
yeah,
going through and reading books and reading histories.
absolutely. Yeah, completely agree.
I have a note here because there's a show that I'm not sure if you're familiar with called You're the Worst.
No, it's not
There,
about me, I hope.
no, it's not.
Huh?
It's not about you. But there is a writer in it, and part of a gag at one point is that he's hired to write the NCIS Los Angeles novel. And the joke is he has this huge like story Bible that he has to look at to prevent him from messing up the continuity. So since you have actually written an NCIS Los Angeles novels, do tell me, how was there a story Bible? And if so, how big was it?
I did not get a story Bible for that one. I have for others. There were other um, tie-ins or TV franchise related novels for which I did get one. That one I didn't. I just sort of it came about really suddenly. Um, I wasn't thinking I was going to do another. I had stopped doing them like 10 years before, but I thought,
Mhm.
it's been a while, and I liked doing them.
Yeah.
Um, I don't watch a lot of TV, which really, is
Which actually
interesting.
probably helps more than anything.
It does, because what I tend to do is just crash it.
Hmm.
So what I did with the NCIS was, and with some of the older series I'd written, we didn't have streaming available, so it was a little more difficult. But here I could just go on whatever it was, CBS, and they had all the episodes. They had 3 or 4 seasons worth. So I just spent a week or two just watching every single episode, and that's how I really got the continuity. Just as an aside, because it's interesting,
Hmm.
one of the series I'd written some novels that were tie-in novels for was a series called Homicide:
Hmm.
Life on the Streets, which was, if you haven't seen it, it's one of the
I
seriously,
haven't.
it's one of the all-time great TV crime detective series. I
Okay.
mean, truly brilliant acting. It was co-produced and by Tom Fontana, who later
Oh.
went up, who's well known for Oz and other things,
Hmm.
who by background is is a playwright, and this guy really has writing chops, and he wrote a lot of the episodes, and those he didn't, he was always at least involved in the writing. But any of them are well written. And this co-producer was Barry Levinson,
Hmm.
the famed movie director. But anyway, um, quite a while before that, I was asked to do uh, 3 novels based on homicide, life on the street. And I remember my editor, after I agreed to do the deal, my editor said, "Oh, by the way, um, Tom Fontana wants to speak to you." And before you do it. Now, I was like, I'm thinking, oh, great. Here's where they're telling me, don't do this, don't do that, don't do
Hmm.
that. Make sure he's driving this kind of car. He always wears gray. And I just thought this is going to be a nightmare. I guess being in that respect, having had some experiences and being a glass half full. So
Hmm.
I call Fontana,
Hmm.
and the first thing he says to me is, "Look, I'm a writer, but I'm not a novelist. This is your thing. So all I'm going to say is I want to give you um, any help I can. We'll just feel free to call us, and so on and so forth. We're here to support you. If there are any things," he offered to give not only a series Bible, but advance notice of certain things that were going to happen in the show. And there was one season that ended in a cliffhanger, and he told me about it and just asked me, please don't write about that because we don't want to give away what happens. Um, so the reason I mention that is this is before a lot of stuff came on the via internet.
Hmm.
And a couple of days or a day later, via FedEx, I get a huge loose leaf that's that thick series Bible you were talking about, um, organized by character backgrounds, and then episode by episode by episode, all sorts of stuff, which I really found great and fascinating. And eh, doing the episodes, I would order uh, cassettes, no, VHS tapes, not cassettes. And again, they would FedEx them to me. I was up in Maine. Their studio was, uh, I think, remains. Fontana
Hmm.
Studios are in um, Lower Manhattan, and they would send them to me, and just it was just great. So that was a really really wonderful relationship, and I'm really proud of those books. I thought they were just tons of fun to do. Um, One of the characters was a detective named Munch in the show, played by the late Richard Belzer, and I made him a romantic interest in one of the books, which was really, if anybody knows Belzer, this really was a departure from type, and this they loved it. I mean,
Hmm.
I got feedback from the cast, so that was really fun.
That's really cool, especially since I've never seen those programs. And now I'm genuinely curious to give it a watch because as a kid, I grew up, my dad loved cop shows. So we'd watch Magnum PI, we'd watch CSI, NCIS, all that fun stuff. So I'll definitely have to give it a look.
Yeah, it's just great drama. I mean, there are some episodes that are like, I don't know what a network TV show would be, what, 44, 48 minutes,
Hmm.
but it's like a 48-minute movie, tightly written, just
Hmm.
beautiful acting. So yeah, if you ever get a chance,
Well,
they're
and especially if
available.
it's good writing, that's the thing
Yeah,
that
exactly.
I
Yeah.
went down the Columbo rabbit hole earlier last year, and the variation of like the really tight good episodes, and then you get as the show goes on and it gets longer, and you're
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh.
Yeah. And when they get pressed for deadlines, there's a famous story about, just really jumping off into a rabbit hole. Star Trek, one of the most famous and best episodes was the two-part menagerie episode, which was actually a film conceived and filmed as the pilot for the
Oh.
original series. So it only featured, there was no William Shatner. The only character from the original Star Trek series that's in that episode is Leonard Nimoy as Spock, and there's a different captain, different everyone. But the interesting thing is, it's one of the best episodes. It was really well written. They never were going to air it. The only reason they did was they got their production schedule kept falling so far behind that now they're like in mid-season and they're just messed up. So they figure, well, we've got this thing in the can. Let's have a framing sequence with our modern day crew with William Shatner and just do it as a two-parter. And
Uh-huh.
that allowed their writers to catch up and write some new episodes. So it's really funny, and yet it's become a classic.
Hmm.
And the basis of a current Star Trek, one of the most successful of the modern latter day Star Trek spinoffs is whatever the new one is called on
Brave New World.
Brave New Worlds,
Hmm.
which features those characters, the characters
Oh, I
from
didn't know
from
that.
yeah, yeah. So it's just it's just interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's part of the fun thing about art, like just in general, is that you never know how something potentially is going to be useful or reused. Or, I mean, really, it's making things and then sometimes you find something that you didn't expect for it.
Yep, yep. I have a probably shouldn't reveal this, but one of my policies is that if I have to cut anything from a novel or anything I'm writing, I really don't like cutting things that I've spent hours and hours working
Uh-huh.
on. So eventually, I make a little pledge to myself that it may take the rest of my life, but I look at those words and I say, you will find a place. And to date, most of my stuff has wormed and weaseled its way into later works. And it's just it's just interesting because it may really change, but
Hmm.
it's like that idea, whatever it was, because generally speaking, I've never really cut stuff because I
Hmm.
thought it was crappy. I've cut it because it just, for whatever
Yeah.
reason, it just, it was scenes, the book was too long, or it just, for just dramatic reasons, it just wasn't working. But the actual writing or the actual ideas behind it generally are things that preoccupy me always. I'm still thinking about stuff that I wrote when I was 11 years old. I still finding its way into the stuff I'm writing now, and it's not that's actually the truth.
So was that when you knew you wanted to be a writer?
I didn't know. I still am not sure about this whole writing gig, but I wouldn't say that. No, no. But it was just that um, I came from a very chaotic household, and my way of escaping that was to I read a lot, and like every 10, 11 year old, I read a lot of fantasy, science fiction, watched all the horror movies and old 50s sci-fi movies, and somehow I just started to write. I guess the thing
Mhm.
was, going back to my knockoff GI Joes, I always had storylines. I
Yeah.
can remember, and they would go on for days. It wouldn't just be for
Hmm.
like for a day or two. These would be long, long serials, so that
Hmm.
interrupted only by calls to dinner. And I actually get angry. I'd be, okay, Ma, 1 minute. I go, to be continued after after dinner, or to be
It's like one of
continued
those old
tomorrow.
Republic serials.
That's what I was doing. I was
Throw
doing
them
my
off the cliff.
I was doing that. So eventually, somehow or other, I decided to sit down and write. And I started on a manual typewriter that I believe belonged to my mother. It was in my room. It was just sitting in a corner. I don't know how. No, I started writing the novel longhand, and
Hmm.
on, and then somewhere around page 20 or so, decided to give the typewriter a crack, and it was almost the term suddenly slipped my mind, but it was almost as if I was in a trance.
Yeah, the hitting that flow state.
Yeah, the novel ended up being 140 pages long, single space with no margin. So it just goes from the top of the page all the way down the bottom, from side to
Wow.
side, and then front and back, because I'm 11 years old. And in some way, I taught myself the correct way to type. I wasn't picking away with two fingers. I have no idea how that how that came about. I truly don't. And the actual writing, like the story to this day, I remember, and I knew, and the characters, of course, but the actual physical act of sitting, automatic writing was the phrase I was looking for. The
Hmm.
actual physical act of writing that book, I do not remember. I cannot, and I think back and I wonder, like, obviously I would come home from school at 3 o'clock. I would sit and have something to eat probably. So probably I would start at whatever, let's just say 3:30, 4 o'clock. But when when did I stop? What was going on around me? I shared a room with my brother, and as I said, there was always, something happening around me,
Hmm.
yelling, screaming, throwing things around. So how I did this, I don't know, but it's very interesting. And I've spent the rest of my life trying to attain that
Hmm.
level of utter focus, that complete flow. And it did recently with one thing I wrote. I came very close to it.
That's
Um,
awesome.
yeah, yeah,
Because I really do think that that is the thing that, like, so runners talk about runner high, which I still think is fictitious, because how can anyone enjoy putting themselves through that kind of physical abuse? But I'm a weightlifter, so like I know what it's like to get the pump.
it, yeah,
That when you can get to that point when you're writing is amazing. That
yeah, yeah,
transcendent space.
yeah. I wrote a novella called Kill Chain, which is in the Net Force series, and I featured two, which I write, and I featured two secondary characters that I liked. They were young
Mm-hmm.
characters. They were a lot of fun. They're best friends, and they're both kind of looking for their place, and they're outcasts for different reasons. And they go off on this island together, and little do they know that one of them in particular, Natasha Marie, one is being hunted by these two cyber enhanced killers who just want to kill her.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they're killers. And um, that story r completely ran away with me. I was just, trying to hold the reins and trying to actually keep down the word count in the end, but that's the one I was referring to, and it went places I didn't expect it to go. The characters revealed themselves to me in ways that were really beautiful. It's a really emotional and funny story in many ways, as well as being an action story.
Mm-hmm.
And but what was really great about it again is that it just like things just kept happening to these two that I didn't expect, and I didn't it to happen. I had no idea how they're going to get out of it. And I was writing it when they were in trouble. I would be afraid for them. And that's not usually the way it goes. My
Mm-hmm.
process is generally um, much more thought out. I may when you're writing an action scene and a character's in danger, yeah, I get uh, I do kind of get pumped up as things are exploding and crashing, but I know I have that scene choreographed.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's
and
storyboarded in your mind at that
yeah,
point.
exactly. But with this, that was all out the window. I didn't know where I was going with it, and so that was very, very similar to what I'd done when I was 12 years old, 11, 12 years old.
Well, that's a good transition point for us to start talking about the Net Force series. One of the things that I assume must be really fun about writing this is that you do have the cast of characters that you do to work with. And that, I think, is always the interesting part in the writing process, is when those characters, that they're just functionary at the start a lot of times, but as you write longer, especially as you expand the series, they start to take on more and more character. So I assume it must have been a blast to get to kind of spin off these characters into that novella with
It,
their own primary storylines.
it really was. There's a lot of I don't want to say editorial pressure, but certainly editors now prefer that you focus on one or two characters.
Mm-hmm.
And really that was true before. I mean, even talking about TV shows, the man from Uncle, Uncle was a big organization. James Bond behind you, you focused on Bond, even though there were many other agents. So this is nothing new. But Net Force, which of course was co-created by Tom Clancy, was created as kind of a team book, and
Hmm.
that was when that took place, which was mid late 90s. There were that I'm not saying it was in vogue, but there were a lot more of that type of books around, uh, con concepts around.
Hmm.
So um, more recently, you're urged to sort of focus on one or two characters. And I felt when we relaunched NetForce and I came up with uh, largely a new set of characters, I really felt the name of the series is NetForce. It's
Hmm.
not, yeah, it's not 007.
Hmm.
So I felt that it had to have an ensemble cast. At the same time, there's that balance. You want to, I mean, there are reasons for that editors want it done a certain way, and I'm assuming it has to do with what their take on the climate is, the marketing climate. There's all these factors involved,
Hmm.
and so yeah. But what to get back to what you're saying, so I as especially after the first book, which was really big and sprawling, I
Hmm.
began to focus on a small handful of characters, although I created a large number in that first book. And as you put it really well, they're just kind of they're functional, and there might be one character element. This person is, shy, or this person is a computer genius, or whatever. It's just that one kind of
Yeah.
pegline that you've got. But um, I really took a cue from, I started thinking about when I knew there's part of the deal there were going to be the novels and these novellas, and I was thinking about how can the novellas be different,
Hmm.
and I suddenly thought about the Star Wars franchise, where
Mm.
now it didn't succeed at first, although now it's beginning to work. But you had the movies, and
Hmm.
then in between they when they relaunched it more recently, and they had the last trilogy of movies, and in between movies there was Solo, and I think another one.
Yeah, Rogue
Solo
One.
was Rogue One, and I don't know, I recall how Rogue One did. Solo didn't do well, but that's that was beside the point. For me, it was interesting because I thought, here's a really neat way to move the focus onto these secondary characters, really flesh
Hmm.
them out. And they had, by this point, I'm 3 or 4 novels into the series, so I knew them better. So there was more meat to them, and I had come to like them. And
Hmm.
then with the second novella, I actually uh, started playing with continuity and thinking, and I thought, well, okay, so I forget which 2 books it was between, but I'm just going to say books, novels 2 and 3 of the series. So I had it take place specifically between 2 and 3. So it was a bridge between the 2 novels. And I introduced concepts in the e-novella that come to fruition, or at least are part of the following novel. And that, I guess that's what they call world building now. And that
Hmm.
became a lot of fun. So I think I completely lost your question, but
That's okay.
uh,
Well, I was asking about the
yeah, yeah,
characters,
the
and
characters.
but that's part of, again, just what's being able to build out. It's kind of like a war of attrition almost. You throw out, it's the idea of you plant 5 seeds, and not all 5 are necessarily going to grow, but at least 2 or 3 of them will.
Yeah,
When you seed the story with so many characters at the start, then as the story progresses, the ones that are going to shine start to shine.
yeah, exactly.
So let
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, how did you get involved in NetForce? Obviously, prior to this, you had written the Power Play series, which was
Yeah,
also a Tom Clancy franchise book.
yeah.
What we think of reboots all the time with movies and television today, but most we don't apply that term to books very often, even though books like reboot over and
Mhm.
over. You've written a Zorro book. You know how that we constantly take literary characters and make new versions of them. So what was it like rebooting the Net Force series?
It was really great. What happened was, um, a significant number of years had passed since I'd done the Power Play series, but I stayed in touch with people, and
Mhm.
um, around 2017, I believe, thereabouts, I started thinking about the Net Force series, which had been canceled. There were three co-written Tom Clancy series, all of which were canceled due to behind the scenes
Mhm.
stuff. So, and they had nothing to do with sales. So I knew these were viable properties.
It's kind of like a studio in a lot of ways. Like we think of movie studios and we don't tend to think of publishing houses or brands the same way, but it
Yeah.
actually that correlates well. Well, all it takes is management changes and something gets cut.
Any sort of, I mean, there's just a lot of
Moving
there's
parts in the
yeah.
background.
Yeah. And also Tom had passed away in 2013, so that changed things. And other people involved, there another person had as well. So
Mm.
stuff happens. So anyway, I started looking at uh, Net Force, and not really so much the how, how the continuity of the series, but the foundation of it, the core concept of that series, which was really ahead of its time, and I
Hmm.
feel one of Tom's more ambitious ideas. Um, so by 2017, 2018, being on the internet was no longer like, for most people going on CompuServe and having the dial-up modem and having, doesn't all of that stuff. And it wasn't just back when NetForce was on, people the action was all virtual because people really saw, internet action as all happening in cyberspace, and so the characters were all sitting somewhere at a computer, and their alter egos were on the internet duking it out. Now, of course, this changed dramatically over the course of whatever it was, 10 or 20 years. So now I saw an opportunity to really, go whole hog with some of the things that were there, but that could really be developed, and also obviously build onto it, as you were saying, and just do a lot of stuff. So I approached the powers that be, and they really went for it. They asked me to do a series Bible, and at that point I began looking at new characters. And the reason we decided to go with new characters is interesting. And that's because the original Net Force series, which again was written late 90s, early
Hmm.
2000s, was a near future series that I believe took place around 2010. Of course,
Mm.
2010 was long past by the time I picked it up, and uh, the future that they projected, of course, didn't never happen the way they thought it would, because this never it's like, where are the flying cars when
Yeah.
where's the Jetsons future?
There's
So
a wonderful gag in Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, where George Jetson is like, "We're from the year 2004." And Birdman looks at his
exactly, this
calendar and it
was
says like
yeah,
2014. He's like,
yeah,
continue.
yeah, this was it. This is what happened. So the only sensible way to do it was to, you couldn't you can't have the iPhone being a magical device in 2026. So it's just relaunched the
Hmm.
series. And um it's interesting. They did that with Bond.
Hmm.
With the Bond novels. I don't know if you read the one that was written right around the time. I believe it came out around the time of the first Daniel Craig Bond movie.
Carte
And,
Blanche is
oh
that
man,
Jeffrey Deaver. It's
I'm
set.
not
It's
sure.
like a rebooted SOE that he's a part of.
Yeah, well,
Hmm.
his background goes from having been in World War II to having been in, I think, Afghanistan or something like
Yeah, I
that.
think that's Carte Blanche.
Yeah, so I've never read the whole novel. I don't know how successful it was, but it was really an attempt to kind of do that with Bond.
Hmm.
Obviously Daniel Craig's Bond was not operating in the same historical or chronological milieu as Sean Connery's. But if and I too am a Bond fan, and I loved Connery. The only Bond I've loved since then was Daniel Craig's. I
Hmm.
completely loved the Craig Bond. So. Um, it seemed an interesting, it seemed a really viable way to go.
Mhm.
So that's what we ended up doing. And I um, also now with Marvel movies and 87 iterations of Batman and Superman with you know Commissioner Gordon becoming a completely different character from one cycle to the next. It actually gave me an opportunity to look at some of the characters that I liked from the first
Mhm.
series and say, well, you know what? It might be cool to have a Julio Fernandez, but have my version of Julio Fernandez be completely the opposite of the Julio Fernandez in the original series, which is what I did. Sergeant Fernandez in the first series was he didn't even know how to type on a computer. He just was he was technologically just completely maladroit. And I made my Fernandez a whiz,
Mhm.
a technological whiz, a complete genius. In fact, he was a an AI program, an AI developer and programmer. So you can play with that kind of thing, and that's a lot of
Mhm.
fun. And because you're playing with readers' expectations, because you don't
Mhm.
know how many readers are going to carry forward from the original series. You
Yeah.
hope some will, but and you also hope that that they won't get mad, that they'll think, well, what do you mean? He's this isn't the same character. You hope that enough will have seen these movies and read these other books to kind of get get what you're doing
Mhm.
and have fun with it.
Well, and
Again, though, you don't know.
I mean, that's again the thing that's just enjoyable about taking a property and breathing new life into it. There was I think they only did like 2, 3 seasons of a DuckTales reboot that changed the animation style. But what was fun for people like me that grew up watching the old version of it, they'd bring back characters and then twist it just enough
Yeah, yeah,
where it was fascinating. To your comment about Bond, like the Dark Knight Rises trilogy, it was because they rebooted that the Bond producers went, hey, we can completely clear the slate and go with these
it's
Daniel Craig
very interesting.
films.
I didn't know that.
And I
Really
mean,
interesting.
it's just cool to see how little things like that all interconnect.
Yeah, yeah.
Because really, again, things like Net Force, we live in a very different world. So the expectations of the reader and the people into now, one of the things I want to point out that I thought you do a fantastic job at is when I first heard the premise of Net Force, I'm like, not just a book where they're doing nothing but stare at tech. Because who wants to read about people sitting in front of a computer all day?
Yeah.
Despite it being a digital and technological premise, there's a lot of actual physical, real world action consequence. And to a spy point here, I've heard at the comment. So, like, I'm not big on the James Bond gadgets from the Brosnan era, just because they're all kind of like
Yeah,
it's not that
I
cool.
agree.
If he has a drone, that means nothing to us today. But
Right,
some things are always going to be cool, like having a secret compartment
right. Everyone
or
loves a secret compartment.
a hidden micro, like they play at that in
Yeah,
Skyfall. He has that little micro transponder.
yeah,
Things like that are always cool.
yeah.
Robot guard dogs and basically, I mean, they're not cyborgs, but making cyborg technologically enhanced humans, those are concepts that are always kind of cool.
Yeah. They're really evergreen concepts. Yeah,
Yeah, so they're not going to age nearly the same way that, oh, having people sit in front of a screen and fight with their virtual avatars does.
exactly, exactly. And what I try to do, and of course, it's not entirely possible. But what I try to do, with the benefit of hindsight, and looking at these other series, is saying, well, is say to myself, well, you know. Let if the series is set 2 or 3 years in the future, a lot of the technology I use is actually probably not going to be really viable in the way it is in the novels for maybe another 10 years. On the other
Mm-hmm.
hand, I can always use the conceit that these secret programs are going on. So do we really know how far along they are? And that's what's great about writing fiction, because you
Yeah.
don't. Um, and I had a great conversation with this very about this very early on. After signing to do the series, I sat with my agent and my editor. We had lunch in a little place downtown Manhattan, and that was one of my questions. It was, well, how I asked my editor, how far along does the technology have to be,
Mhm.
existing technology have to be for me to really write about it in the way I want to in NetForce, even though I think I'm not really sure that we're there. Or I'm not sure when we're going to be there, and or that we will ever really get there in the way I'm writing about it. And my editor kind of thought about it, and he said, I think I think a good guideline is, if you're reading about its development
Mhm.
in what we consider to be reputable, um, from reputable sources, magazines, um, uh, military white papers.
Mhm.
If you see New York Times, Wall Street Journal, whatever, if there are periodicals that have stories written about its development, then you're pretty good to go ahead and run with it. And it proved to be a really good rule of thumb. And again, you're not going to nail it all the time, but there's that consideration. And then what you say is really true. It's like, when will a robot dog, not, a robot attack dog, not be cool? It will always be cool. So,
Uh, I've just recently finished reading Moving Target, and one of the things I thought was really cool about the setup of the book is a large part of it takes place in underground catacombs. Again, there are some things that are always cool. That should be like a new podcast. I'm always coming up with new ideas to spin off into another podcast. Some things are always cool. Talk about the things that are just always cool. Catacombs are always cool. And what I like is that it provides an interesting juxtaposition of history, just the scope. You literally have dead bodies from past times. They refer to the French Revolution a lot against these blood lightning mercenary guys who are technologically advanced humans. And it provides a good, interesting contrast in a fascinating context.
yeah, yeah. Thanks a lot. That was another instance where the story ran away with me. The whole catacomb storyline was meant to resolve somewhere around page 30, and I won't say when it resolves, but I'll say that you can safely assume that as you're pushing page 300, you're still in the catacombs. But in fact, there are something like, I don't know if it's 2.5 or 6 miles. I think it's more like 2.5 miles of catacombs that are open and accessible to the public in beneath the streets of Paris. However, there are 200 miles of tunnels down there, many of which have not been explored in hundreds and hundreds of years. Napoleon had ordered them mapped, and he actually had a commission, and he had this guy with a group of a handful of, I don't know how many men, uh, marching through the catacombs with their oil lamps and trying to find, mark them as street names. Um, as I started to do the research, just to back up, I love, like, put me underground in a cave, give me a place I can crawl around under, inside, under. Again, when I was a kid playing with my action figures, or we didn't call them that then, they were just dolls. I was always under the blanket. I'd
Uh-huh.
pull a blanket over my head because this was my world, and like that section, my raised right knee was a mountain, was this mountain, and my left was a volcano. But so I've always loved being in dark
Mm-hmm.
places. So this, of course, appealed to me. Um, Getting back to it, I started reading about how there are uh, Paris, modern day Parisians who call themselves cataphiles,
Mm.
and they almost lead secret lives or second lives, so that You can have the person who's an attorney or a corporate accountant or whatever on the surface. And then on weekends, they actually access elite portions of the catacombs that are prohibited. And there's a component of the Parisian police force that's assigned to catacombs. So they bust people who are down there, and they're down there having raves. There are artists who have galleries down there. There are sculptures down there. It's really fascinating. So again, I started thinking about, well, what if there's this subculture in the near future that um, are they're down there for a reason. I mean, they're down there for a political reason. They're in the story. Not giving too much away to say they're trying to protect someone who's in hiding from the bad guys, and they too also have these surface lives, and but below are they wear makeup, sort of Clockwork Orange type or Blade Runner type makeup, so that they become anonymous in a certain way. The two characters I focus on are Jacques and Gilles, or of course Jack and Jill, and we never learn their real names. As my one of my protagonists, Kali, meets them down there. She's there to on a mission, and she's in a lot of trouble, and she encounters these two characters. They, of course, well, they're not going to give her their real names. They don't really know exactly who she is. They don't exactly trust her. So one just says, "My name is Jacques," and one says, "My name is Gilles," and that's who I refer. That's how I refer to them throughout the story. We never learn their real names, and I think that's really interesting because I have some idea what Jacques was
Hmm.
in his surface life, but I don't really know. I have a little more about Gilles, but that actually revealed itself to me as the story went along, in the way we were talking about before. So that was really fascinating, and I really did like that juxtaposition of um, all of these bones and thrones made out of bones and avenues made out of bones, all of which exist at the behest of Napoleon,
Hmm.
because he had gone to Rome and looked at the Roman catacombs and seen he admired what they did with the decorating they did with skeletons. So he came back to Paris and said, I want to make this a tourist attraction. And that's really the reason that they have, um, uh, he was known as what, the great architect, the great builder or something, one of
Yeah.
his nicknames. So he obviously had his own franchise in mind, and anyway, that's what happened there.
Wrapping up here, I'd like to ask you if you have a writing routine, and if so, what does it look like?
The answer is yes, and it's pretty it's pretty rigid. I get up early every morning, probably uh, 5:30, whenever the cat starts tapping me on the head.
Better than an
I
alarm clock.
better I actually think since I've had cats, I really haven't needed alarm clocks for years. So I have some toast coffee. I go into my office. I usually start by going over what I wrote the previous day where I left off, because that is kind of a low pressure entree into that day's writing. Truman Capote was um, tragically and notoriously tormented by the blank page in front of him, and now it's the blank screen
Hmm.
nowadays, and that's intimidating for most writers. So I don't think that's an unusual technique. Is kind of look at what you did the day before, start. I write uh, sequentially. So in essence, if I go back a page or two and start writing what I wrote yesterday, going over what I wrote yesterday, it leads me into today's writing. And I usually write from again, whatever, around 6, 7 a.m. through lunch. I usually break for lunch at around 1, take an hour and a half, go back to work and write until maybe 6:30, 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. That kind of depends on how close I am to deadline or
Mhm.
how much I'm getting done. Maybe I'm getting a lot done and just don't want to stop, or I haven't gotten a lot done and really want to feel like I had a productive day. It could be either one. Um, and that's pretty much my routine. It's when I'm in the thick of writing a novel, it's at least 6 days a week, sometimes seven. Um, and that's it. That's every day.
And that's how books get written.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
It, it,
it's one of those things that I find when I talk to people that want to be authors or will, meet someone on the street, they hear that you write. They're like, oh, I've got a great idea for a book. I'm like, that's nice. The idea is the easy part. It's the finishing,
it's
writing, doing
yeah.
the actual thing.
Yeah, it's like I always say I don't have a tremendous amount of I don't have a lot of tips for young writers. I suppose I would if I was really in a conversation. But the one thing, if people ask me, is what is the one thing, and it's just do the reps. If you only have 15 minutes a day, first of all, determine how much time you have and look at it realistically. It may change. Obviously, it's going to change. But if it's 15 minutes, do it for that 15 minutes and be diligent about that 15 minutes. And that's the only way you're going to do it. And that's I always use again a sports metaphor. That's how baseball players get to be good hitters. It's
Mm-hmm.
doing the reps, or any athlete really. So it's
Mm-hmm.
all the same.
I love the comparison of writing to athletics just because I do think that there is a performance aspect to it where you have to, especially when you're doing a nonfiction book, the research and the prep work you're doing in advance to then be able to step up to the plate and do the actual thing.
Yeah, yeah, and extending that metaphor, I happen to be a tremendous baseball fan. So for me, there are many comparisons, and I kind of sometimes I look at a baseball player who's struggling, or somebody who's not, or who's working his way out of a slump, and I a guy, a pitcher who's on the mound and suddenly just can't quite execute, or whatever, makes a minor adjustment and he's throwing fastballs with pinpoint accuracy again. Um, there are real comparisons, and the bottom line, the real essence of it, I think, is focus and concentration and repetition. In fact, those it's kind of like three good points: focus, or concentration and repetition, at least.
Yeah, I love it. Jerome, this has been a pleasure. Where can people go to learn more about you and your work?
Um, uh, I'm on. I have look my Facebook page, my Amazon page. I have a website that I'm pathetically bad at maintaining. But you can find my books anywhere online, and just Google me. Just do the old Google, and I'm there.
It works so well, especially now today. Google like brings up, I mean, if I search your name, all of your books come up
There,
right there.
my pictures. I say, wow, I didn't know I looked like that. It's all there. So I'm easy to find.
And what's your most recent book out right now?
Moving Target is the most recent one, and working on some other classified stuff right now. So yeah,
Well, people should be sure to check it out. We'll link it all in the show notes. Jerome, thank you again for coming on the show.
I've had a blast. Thanks very much. It was a great conversation.